Hi, this is Sean McLean, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Think Hard, Write Hard. Have you ever wondered why some stories grab you and hold you, while others seem to make you feel distant or removed from the scene? This is likely because the point of view, or a POV, has been, in a good sense, properly crafted and used to engage you, make you feel part of the scene, versus either improperly done or improperly chosen point of view that makes you feel removed. The POV, or point of view, is one of the most important tools in a writer's toolkit. It helps the writer create the feelings of what the reader sees, hears, and feels. The goal of this video today is to help you understand what the POV is, how it works, how to craft it, and how to best use it for your story. So now, for experienced professional writers or English majors, this video might seem old hand or basic. But for me, as a new novelist, learning and understanding POV was a critical step in my journey of writing my debut novel, The Devil in the Blue. When I first finished my draft, my entire draft of about 150,000 words as a rough draft, I received some comments from my first editor who questioned what appeared to be a third-party omniscient narrator. Now, when I first heard this term, I didn't quite grasp exactly what I was doing. It wasn't conscious, I'll put it that way. What I have been doing, apparently, is as I narrated my story, which I pretty much developed in a linear fashion, each scene or chapter or whatever had more than one character typically. And when I was in each scene, I tended to just write all the perspective of every character in that scene, if there was more than one. This caused me to either head hop, which is, head hopping is, again, this may be common parlance to you, but for me it was a new term. Head hopping is when the reader is pushed around in different heads of the characters without a proper section break or perspective shift. It can become jarring, that's the word, the parlance as well, jarring when the reader is being pulled around in different heads and it's hard to keep track of who's thinking and why. Another problem I think that I was experiencing with the third-party omniscience was I was losing track of whose scene it belonged to. For example, a scene could belong to a certain character and needed to belong to that character, but I would be continuously pulling out of that character's perspective into another perspective, even if properly done. But what this did was it caused the reader to cause the reader to become less involved in the scene, less immersed. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to take one scene and we're going to review it in different perspectives, first person, third person limited, and third person omniscient. In this way, we can see how the POV is utilized and used. Then, after we've gone through that example, the same scene from 3 different POVs, I like to spend a few minutes going over some samples from my own book, just to show you kind of where, how I use the section breaks, the structure of the section breaks, as well as perspective shifts to keep the reader engaged in the story, maintain focus on a particular character. But importantly, I want to show where the kind of the techniques that I use in the thought process, that where you could not only have section breaks, but probably the most basic ability is the section break by a space or I use 3 stars, as you'll see. But the perspective shift is a more, I guess, a technical way to shift perspective without jarring the reader. And I think it's helpful to see at least one technique how I did it. And then lastly, I'd like to discuss a couple, I think, fantastic examples of using the POV, more than one POV in the same book, to not only for a literary effect, but as a tool to provide the reader the ability to stay immersed in the story, but also give them more perspectives without jarring them or head hopping as it goes. Well, let's get started with the scene, and then we'll move on to my novel and then final remarks. The scent of ozone always hits right before the glass breaks. I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, my knuckles turning white as the first hairline fracture zipped across the display case. It wasn't the artifact I cared about. It was the fact that Miller was standing right outside that door, completely oblivious to the silent alarm I'd just tripped. Now, for ease, I did highlight in red text the emphasis on why it is first person. Obviously, the emphasis on I gripped, my knuckles, I cared about. So this is where I think the first person is sort of the easiest to, not only to identify but to maintain. It's just always the person who's living the POV from the person who's narrating. Now, there's one thing here that I want to ask. I'm going to pause for a moment here, but ask the question first. Look at this text and try to imagine what actually could be missing in that text alone. So what is actually missing is, how can, if it's just first person in that paragraph alone, how can the narrator know that Miller is right outside the door without some kind of another fact or some kind of perspective, another anchor to let you know that? For example, we're now going to modify the text where you have, where it says, I could see Miller's shadow underneath the door. When that phrase is there, it gives you the perspective anchor that now that the narrator can know that Miller is there. Now, again, this is just a kind of a sample that it was added there as a single paragraph. You could have had a fact before that says that Miller told the narrator, "I'll be standing outside the door here." That way, the narrator would know. But what's critical, I think, in any POV, including first person, is whoever's speaking and narrating has to know everything that they're saying as the first person. So you ask yourself, well, how can that person know that? Should they know that? And when you see something like that, the fix can be relatively simple, like we've added here. And I would add this too, is that fix actually not only gives the factual basis or the anchor to the narrator's perspective, it actually adds, you can actually kind of make it a literary thing. And, the shadow pacing underneath the door adds some tension. And I think it adds some pressure to the narrator because now he knows someone out there is waiting and it puts more pressure on him. The other thing I'll add here too is you could also say, well, the person doesn't know that the alarm is going off, Miller. That's okay because the alarm is silent. So because it's silent, Miller couldn't know that the alarm is going off. So that actually works by itself. So now we're going to move to the point of view from the third person limited. The scent of ozone always hit right before the glass broke. Arthur gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white as the first hairline fracture zipped across the display case. He didn't care about the artifact itself. His chest tightened with panic because he could see Miller's shadow pacing under the doorframe, completely oblivious to the silent alarm Arthur had just tripped. So here, again, the scene is the same, but now you're watching the scene unfold from now, instead of I, first person, now you're seeing it, you're watching Arthur do the same scene. And, now it's his name, he didn't care, his chest. So because now, again, now this is where I think the artistic question can come into play is it more emotionally charged if it's at first person, I am doing something, perhaps, but I think the third person limited can also be very helpful because it does put you're still there watching it happen. And again, it may not be as emotionally charged, but I think it's focused on one person at a time. Right, that's another key structure too. Is the scene has to be in the single POV. You don't get to hear what Miller thinks in first person or third person limited. It's always from that single narrator. And again, I left the change in there too, is the pacing on the door is still occurring because it can just be now Arthur still doing it. Just you're having it from the third person's perspective. So now we're going to move on to the third person omniscient. The scent of ozone always hit right before the glass broke. Arthur gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white as the hairline fracture zipped across the display case. He didn't care about the artifact itself. His chest tightened with panic because he could see Miller's shadow pacing under the doorframe.
Outside the heavy door, Miller hummed a mindless tune, oblivious that the silent alarm was already broadcasting the location to the authorities. So here, the first part of it is still third person because you're looking down on Arthur. So that still kind of remains generally the same, including his view of Miller pacing under the door. But then this is the critical difference now. Now you'll see when the POV includes in this paragraph Miller humming to himself outside the door. So now you have moved over to Miller outside humming this mindless tune. Well, that's not coming from Arthur so much. That's a third person omniscient narrator in a way jumping over to Miller. Now, this is where I think there's many things to take apart here, actually, in this third person omniscient. The first thing is you have multiple characters in the same section. And I think this is where you start. The first question is, well, who do you want the scene to be on? Is it better for the POV to be on one person, Arthur, for example, instead of jumping over to Miller at the same time and giving you two POVs? Now, you could also argue it's head hopping because now you're jumping over to Miller, and Miller is humming a tune oblivious to something. Well, that's, again, is it head hopping? You know who it is, but it's better to focus on one person, I believe, because this is where you start to say, well, who is the scene about? Do I have to have both? Does it remove Arthur's fear and anxiety when he is inside, doing the break-in? And I think this is where, for me, in my book, I think I had sort of the same concern when I started doing third person omniscient. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I think I was removing the importance or the weight on a certain character where you can feel immersed and feel closer or intimate with that character. When you have more than one character in one scene, I think you can dilute what, again, and we'll talk about this at the end of the video, there are cases where I think that it could be useful. I think it depends on the circumstance, of course, but I think the third person omniscient can be complicated for that very reason. Now that we've done those three examples, I'd like to spend a few minutes with some examples from my novel, The Devil in the Blue. These three examples are from chapter 2, and these are just to kind of show the approach of how the third person limited can work and staying within that POV, but still telling the story and learning about not only the narrator, but the other character or characters in the scene as well. So in this section, I'll go to the first box on the left. You'll notice that this character in this chapter is from third person of Benny. But Benny is, and you'll notice that he is the one that is noticing things such as her accent. And you'll see in this line, where you're from, he hears her accent as Eastern European. He doesn't know, but he hears Eastern European. Because what else would he know other than what he hears? You'll notice in the third paragraph where he reads her name tag, and therefore he can know her name is Katerina, at least as far as he knows is Katerina, because that's on her name tag. Next page, top of the page, you'll say she was not tall. Benny thought her 5'6", because again, all you can do when you're in a limited POV is that's what you can see and hear and what you feel. So what that character feels. So here, he's just sort of guessing, and you'll see that he's quite accurate at it, but that is because he's viewing her. And then you move down to the bottom of the page, and her face reddened. Again, he can see her face. So again, this is staying within the character, but also says that she is embarrassed or perhaps shocked. You don't know exactly why, at least in that one sentence, because all you read is Benny's reaction, which is that her face flushed. So here this is the end of chapter 2. So this is the same scene at the restaurant. And I highlight this point because, as I mentioned earlier, I think the standard way to maintain a consistent POV without head hopping is you use section breaks, either maybe a space or a couple spaces or star, which is what I use. Or you just go to new chapter for a different scene. But there are some circumstances where you want to maintain continuity of the scene, but of course not head hop. But so there is a way to do that. And what I try to do that here is, you'll notice in the red text, in the red box, is that the beginning, the rest of the entire chapter is from Benny's perspective. But at the end, when Benny leaves the restaurant, the scene does shift in the mid paragraph, and that is where now Katerina picks up the card and she looks at his business card. That is now shifting to Katerina's perspective. Now, I will say that this used to be a section break. I had a star, star, star. But looking at it further, because it was a very short POV shift and it happened at the end of a chapter, I thought that the continuity of the scene, I want to use the word more elegant, because once Benny gave her the card and leaves the restaurant, it's not an unnatural shift for Katerina to look at the business card. And then that is the signal, the shift of perspective of her looking at the card and watching him walk out of the restaurant. Is that head hopping? You could argue it's the same scene, but I think there is a physical shift with the card in her hand to watch him leave, and I think it adds a literary effect. Now, I will also add, and we'll talk about this in one of the later examples, if the scene was to have continued, I would not have done a POV shift like that without a section break. Because it's the end of the chapter, I thought it was okay. Again, if it wasn't the end of the scene, I would have done a section break if I was going to change a POV. So my approach is, if I'm going to do a POV shift without a section break or a chapter, then I would only do it once at the end, because that way there's no going back to another POV. So let's move over to the last example from my book. So this text you're looking at now in the red box, this particular scene is a conversation between the character Benny, who was in an early chapter, and a new character, Lewis. Now, this chapter begins with the perspective of Benny, and he's having a discussion with this other character, Lewis. So the rest of the scene doesn't necessarily matter so much, but as a lead-in, Benny is preparing to send Lewis some photographs of this woman, Katerina. If you'll see in this text here, Lewis is asking for some photos and Benny is sending them. So you'll see this top of the line text is Benny speaking, looking, found them, sending now, sent. The next dialogue line is, got him, Lewis said. Lewis opened the photos on his phone. He was stunned. So this is the POV switch without a section break. And the device to enable this is the phone. And so the way I did it was, this was a physical manifestation of the change. And again, I think this is important because this scene it's kind of a continuing scene between the two characters speaking. And to put a section break, I think would have seemed unnatural. But it was an important point for me at this point in the chapter to move over to the other character, Lewis, so he could opine on what this character, Katerina, looks like. And for us, this is relatively early in the story, but that I don't want to have any spoilers. But this character, Lewis, it's important that he has a view in this section. Now, I will note here too, this is where at the end of this chapter, there is a shift back to the POV, to the original character, Benny. But in that case, I do a section break at the end of the chapter. At the end of the chapter, even though it's a small, brief paragraph, because this, as this red text suggests, this was not at the end of the chapter, and there was another POV shift. So because of that, I didn't want to have a second one that was just a non-structural shift. There's no section break. I tried to have an act to go back to the original POV. I didn't want to have it go back to another one without a section break. So there's a section break at the end of this chapter that returns back to Benny. So I'd like to spend the last few minutes highlighting 3 novels which I believe are of tremendous instructional value and highlight the artful way that POV can be used not just to enhance the story and bring the reader in to the characters, but also just, almost like an instructional way of offering alternatives to just simply third person limited or first person. So John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, I did not know this until I started researching for this video, is structured intentionally where the odd chapters are third party omniscient, and that's where John Steinbeck used those chapters to talk about bigger issues, social issues, conditions, environmental questions that would have been, I'm guessing, perhaps awkward to have an individual be talking about. And then in the even chapters, he uses that as the third, as to get into the characters' minds and how they react, and in third person limited. Now, there's many characters in there in those chapters, the Jode family, and you get those limited perspectives. But those are third party. But those are the even chapters. And in the introduction to my version, the Penguin Classic, the introduction actually highlights that the structure of the novel, I think they called it a magic lantern, to shed light on just the stories, because the structure itself was intentional and creative. So the next example I'd like to highlight is No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy. So what I want to highlight here is that there's two POVs generally. There's the narrator, which is in first person of Sheriff Bell. Then the other parts of the book for the other characters, they are in third person detached or objective. And this is fascinating because it is third person limited, but you don't get inside the head of the characters, what they're thinking and what they're feeling. You get their POV from things that they do and what they speak. So for all the characters. So people I think tend to think, well, the villain Anton Chigurh, you just see his actions, but that applies to all the characters. So again, that's third person limited, but it's objective or detached. So again, that's not where you have their feelings or their emotions. The actions are happening sort of like a fly on the wall watching that person, but you're never really inside their head except for what they say and maybe how they physically act. So the last example is Peter Benchley's Jaws. So this is a particularly fascinating example because Peter Benchley is actually, he's dealing with a non-human, the shark. So chapter 1, it's truly a masterpiece. Chapter 1 begins with, one of the best starting lines in a novel. But it starts with the fish, with the shark, not actually called a fish, but it starts from the inanimate object, the non-human swimming in the water. Then it moves back to a third-party omniscient narrator watching the scene on the beach when the young man and woman go out to go swimming. Then it switches to a third person limited to the victim. So it's visceral and terrifying because now from her perspective, no longer third party omniscient, which would remove some of the fear. It's much more direct and is frankly terrifying. So those three examples, again, this is not talking about the merits of those works, although they're fantastic. It's more about that the structure of those, the POV is used to enhance the story and provide a mechanism to tell a story in a unique way. So I hope that was interesting. Again, I'd like to hear any comments you might have or any suggestions, what your opinions are. And again, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and feel free to subscribe. Thank you.